Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. That you're having a good week. I know that you're very busy and writing papers and doing exams. And so, just very happy that you're here and that you're ready to engage as usual. I know that sometimes it's more difficult than other times to make it to class, even when we're all at home. So, thanks for being here. It's good to see you. Before we get started today, I want to do a bit of a current event, actually, where we address some, I guess, bills, more like 250 of them. Across the United States, Republican legislatures are introducing voting measures that could create hurdles for tens of millions of voters. And this is obviously related to much of what we've talked about in class. And we've talked at least at some length about who benefits from less turnout, who benefits from more turnout. We've talked about the politics of turnout and how, in particular, the rules around voting can encourage or discourage voter turnout by making it more difficult or easier for voters to make it to the polls. Before we get started today, I just want to step back for a moment and discuss this. How does this relate to the class? Do you have any thoughts on this? Do you have an opinion, or have you been watching this unfold? What in general can we say about this after discussing these issues in class? Does anyone have any thoughts? Let me ask you this way. Why didn't the Democratic Party introduce all these measures? Why was it the Republican Party?
Could it be because there's a higher percentage of like mail-in votes that are for the Democratic Party, like we saw in like the recent election, where the backlash was that like all the mail-in ballots that hadn't been voted yet, that hadn't been counted, were for like Biden, and a lot of people were saying like, oh, they're all for Biden, what a coincidence. But it was because the Democratic Party had pushed so much for mail-in ballots.
Well, there's certainly a component of this that relates to mail-in voting, but these restrictions are far more encompassing than just mail-in voting. So it seems to be aimed at just restricting voting in general. Mail-in voting is part of that. It is true, as you point out, that Democratic voters voted via mail-in voting in much larger numbers than Republican voters, but part of that was because the Republican Party told their voters not to and cast doubt on mail-in voting and called it not credible. And actually, there's some evidence that that might have influenced the turnout in the runoff in February in Georgia for those two Senate seats, which ultimately were won by the Democratic Party. But yeah, there's certainly the mail-in component, but it's so much broader than that, it seems, because these measures are more encompassing than just the mail-in component. So, Eduardo, this relates to bills that Republican-held legislatures have introduced that would curtail voting access by reducing polling places, making it more difficult to mail in vote, all sorts of requirements regarding, new forms of identification. Basically, these are measures that would restrict voting. And what we want to discuss is how this relates to the class. And, I asked you, why is it the Republican Party that seems interested in restricting voting? Why isn't it the Democratic Party that introduced these bills? And I'd like us to think about the politics of voter turnout and who benefits ultimately from more voting, and maybe who benefits from less. And we could be candid about this, but generally speaking, there are those who benefit from more voting and those who benefit from less. And so the politics of turnout is as interesting as turnout itself. And we have more commentary on this issue. Ernie says, I think this will decrease voter turnout. Certainly, I think that's the goal. Tessa says, if you're losing the game, you change the rules. Yeah, that really captures it. That puts it in a nutshell, doesn't it? If you can't win elections, then maybe curtail the scope of those who can participate in elections, and specifically in ways that would disproportionately affect the voters of the opposing party. And so that seems what's going on here. Courtney says it is also because the Republican parties gain more with low voter turnout compared to Democratic parties. And that raises an interesting question, doesn't it, Courtney? Which is, why is it that more voter turnout seems to be good for the Democratic Party in this case, and not the Republican Party? But we could just as easily say that, generally speaking, in most countries, more turnout will benefit those parties that are more inclined to change the system. And you might dispute that the Democratic Party is a progressive party, but at least compared to the Republican Party, they are the more reformist alternative. But the question is, why is it that higher turnout seems to favor the more reformist or progressive party? And it's often because the vast majority of the voting public is relatively moderate by definition. In a democratic society, the margins are the extremes, and the voters in the middle tend to uh, embrace and promote gradual change or improvements, or at least enough change that it would be objectionable to some of the beneficiaries of the status quo, who are represented by the conservative party. And in our case, that's the Republican Party. So the voting public is by and large relatively moderate and to some degree progressive. And so they will at least endorse more change than would those elements of the of often the conservative party in a given system. And so when more people can vote, you expect more change. And so oftentimes those conservative parties will object to extending the vote to more and more groups. That's the same reason that in early 20th century Latin America, elites opposed extending the vote to women, Indians, anyone basically who wasn't a white male. So it's not just the United States. This is the situation in most countries. In their political development, we can always pick out similar patterns where conservative parties tend to object to extending the vote and extending rights to new groups. And so in that context, it's easy to understand why curtailing voting rights and voting access might be viewed as advantageous for the Republican Party. And especially considering that in the most recent elections, they lost crucial ground in battleground states and in states that previously were considered reliably Republican strongholds. And so, as Tessa says, if you can't win the game, you change the rules. And that seems to be what's going on here. Oscar says the Republican Party benefits from low voting turnout. If less people are allowed to vote or vote by mail, since the people who vote and use those measures are typically Democrats. Alex says, I feel like they would if they would benefit from it. Of course, right? The politics of turnout matters as much as turnout. Certainly, Grace. I think so. Grace points out that larger numbers of minorities voted than ever, especially in places like Georgia in the runoff, where that group in particular, in places like Fulton County, clinched it and really tilted the balance of power for the Democratic Party. So blacks were registered and voted in large numbers and larger numbers than ever before. And so it shouldn't be surprising. It's just almost striking how obvious it is. And Chandon points out that, look, we expect higher turnout when historically marginalized groups are able to vote. And so whenever we've enfranchised new groups, women, minorities, natives, indigenous people, not just in the US, but in all sorts of societies, voter turnout increases because the voting eligible population increases and then the raw numbers of votes do too. And we then can see that when we understand who supports different parties, it stands to reason that restricting voting could be advantageous for certain parties and detrimental to others. Oscar says, I believe the Democratic Party has the most registered voters, but not all voters participate in elections, mainly if the opposite party tries to implement new laws to make it more difficult to vote. So these are all important points, and you've made some interesting points. And I wanted to talk about this because when we talk about political behavior, clearly institutions are an important component of that. And Jackman, in the article from last week, shows us that compulsory voting, unicameralism, proportionality, these sorts of institutional factors tend to increase voting. But we can just as easily see that there are also rules and institutional factors that can decrease voting. And those would include some of these restrictive voting measures that might do anything from reducing the number of polling places to reducing the number of days during which you can early vote, reducing the days available to you for registration, reducing the days available to you for mailing in a vote or obtaining or requesting a mail-in ballot. There are an infinite number of ways that they can curtail access to voting, and these would all fall under that heading of institutional factors. It's just that in this case, these factors are reducing voting or intended to reduce voting. We could suggest that the spirit of these laws is that they could reduce voting, that they are designed to reduce voting. Okay, everyone, so we're going to return to the thread that we dropped on Monday, and that thread is turnout in developing countries. And remember that what we've tried to do so far is talk about how is developing country turnout different from developed country turnout, and what are some of the challenges or impediments or obstacles or catalysts to turnout in developing countries. And we talked about, for example, that developing countries are by definition lower income and a larger share of the population is poor and has a difficult time meeting basic needs. So consequently, if income should predict voting on an individual level, as well as an aggregate level, we should expect lower turnout just on that basis alone. We also talked about how developing countries often have higher rates of violence or disorder or insecurity and how this might impact voting. We talked about how education and literacy rates might be lower and how these might all impact voting. We talked about how they might be less competitive, the democracies in these types of countries, and therefore maybe voting is affected as well. And all of these different circumstances might help us to understand how developing country voter turnout is different than developed country voter turnout. And we talked about Nigeria as an example of how, for instance, low satisfaction with government can contribute to low turnout, and how high corruption and weak or ineffective institutions can contribute to low turnout. But I also wanted to give you an example of a developing country that has very high turnout and that doesn't conform to that pattern. And that country is India. India has a very vibrant political culture and a very inclusive political culture, despite a history of of hierarchical social stratification systems and the caste system. And despite a history that hasn't been inclusive, it is an inclusive democracy where they do everything they can to make it possible for people to vote. And in the most recent elections in 2019, India had a voter turnout rate of 67% of the voting eligible population. And considering it's a poor country with low literacy rates of only 75% and low educational attainment across the board, and considering that most people still live in rural areas where public service delivery is relatively poor, that's a very high turnout given all of that. And so I want to give you an insight into elections in India and how they facilitate that kind of voter turnout and how they get such a high share of eligible voters to go to the polls. So this is like a 6 or 7 minute video. It's really well produced and it captures a lot of what I just discussed, but it stands in stark contrast to the picture that comes from Nigeria, where clearly there are many more impediments to high turnout. But anyway, let's take a look at the video and then we'll get back together in a moment and discuss it.
The world's biggest democracy just had an election.
The world's biggest democratic election.
Marathon election.
A mammoth undertaking.
The world's biggest exercise in democracy.
In India, voters picked its central government for the next 5 years. An eighth of the world's population was eligible to vote in this election.
This year, 2019, there are 900 million eligible voters in India, making this the largest democratic exercise in the history of humanity.
But this isn't a video about Indian politics, because before India's people can even cast their vote, the election needs to come to them. Polling stations need to be set up wherever people live. And in one of the largest and most populous countries in the world, that isn't an easy task. India has to reach voters in coastal cities in the south, in the rural regions of the west, and jungles to the east, and everywhere in between.
And what's more, they want every Indian citizen to be within 2 kilometers of a voting station.
That's only about 25 city blocks, no matter where you are in the country.
It's an incredibly ambitious goal, and yet somehow they're able to do it.
This is the biggest election in the world, and I wanted to know, how does it work? Every election, a team of government officials and security forces get on a boat in the east of India to take off towards this island. They travel about 100 kilometers to get here, all to securely deliver these electronic voting machines, or EVMs, the instrument that logs India's votes, the heart of this elaborate election process. India has 2.3 million voting machines for its 900 million voters. So getting these machines close to every voter is a big logistical undertaking. That's why India doesn't have a single election day. Instead, it's closer to an election month with multiple phases that last weeks. This process takes more than 11 million election officials and security forces who move from polling station to polling station to polling station, from densely populated cities to the rural areas where the majority of Indians live. Once on the island with the EVMs, officials pile onto bike carts and head towards the polling station. Once they arrive, they begin setting everything up for the vote.
তাদের তো বহুত ধন্যবাদ যে এখানে এসে ওনারা আমাদের ভোটটা নিচ্ছেন।
তাদের জন্য আমাদের তো খুবই শুভেচ্ছা ভালোবাসা রইল।
আমার বক্তব্য সবার কাছে পৌঁছতে পারছি এই আর কি।
On election day, voters line up, cast their vote, and get their fingers inked to prevent double voting. This is where the process ends for the voters. But for the election officials, this is just the beginning. Driving a boat out to a remote island is just one of many ways that officials reach every voter. India's vast and diverse terrain requires transportation methods of all kinds. Like in the jungles of this northern state, where elephants transport voting machines to reach a remote town, or in the Himalayas, where officials hike for hours to bring EVMs for election day. Helicopters, trains, they even use camels. But what makes India's elections so impressive isn't just how they reach everyone in such a big country. That's just half the battle. It's also the ways they try to include voters of all backgrounds into the process, a challenge that has been a part of India's elections since the very beginning. India has 22 official languages and hundreds of dialects. And when India became an independent nation, less than a quarter of the population could read and write. The newly formed Election Commission of India created a range of symbols to correspond to each political party, like an elephant, a lotus, a hand, or even an alarm clock. So that from the beginning, all people, regardless of literacy level and language, could vote with confidence. Since 1947, the literacy rate has increased significantly, but it's still only 75%, so these symbols are still useful to many when casting a vote. But this is a massive, sprawling operation. And over the years, it's run into some pretty serious problems, like allegations of election rigging and problems with a practice called booth capture, where gangs actually take over polling stations and tamper with the elections. It's partly because of these problems that the commission introduced these voting machines in the 1990s. It also increased security around the elections. These efforts to include all voters and protect elections seem to be working. In 2019, India saw the highest voter turnout yet. And for the first time, women voted just as much as men.
ভোটটাই তো আমার কাছে ইম্পর্টেন্ট, কেননা আমরা এখানকার বাসিন্দা, ভালোর জন্য, উন্নতির জন্য।
India's elections are only getting bigger and more complicated. India has one of the fastest growing populations in the world, and in 2020, young people will make up more than a third of the country.
I voted for the first time since turning 18, and this is my indelible ink mark. Done with our voting.
So happy that I did my voting for the first time. Yes.
This is the biggest election in the world. It takes millions of officials fanning out across a massive country to help hundreds of millions vote. Every part of this, the symbols, the elephants, the boats, the machines, shows how hard it is to make sure that everyone in a country this large can participate. And all without going more than 2 kilometers from home.
So let's just underscore what's striking about this case. Remember that all of our models would suggest that India has low voter turnout, relatively poor country. Literacy rates are still relatively low at 75%. Much of the population still lives in the country as opposed to urbanized centers. And there are so many different languages and so many different political parties that it can appear very disorganized and very fragmented. And so consequently, perhaps maybe voter turnout is lower because of weaker institutions or on and on and on. India wouldn't be anticipated to have high voter turnout, but they have high voter turnout, especially for a country at that income level and that literacy rate. And so 67-68% is relatively high. And it's notable because not only is that high for developing countries, but it's an improvement over time for India. if you noticed in 1962, when they had the first election, I think that turnout was something like 52 or 53%, and so it was substantially lower than what it is now. And it's interesting to consider how much turnout might increase still if India becomes a richer country and if literacy rates continue to climb. So at this point, we want to begin to think about the different perspectives on turnout and the different approaches to explaining turnout that might be useful in analyzing a case like India or any case for that matter. And we can really identify four families of approaches. These four families are evident in much of the content that we've discussed so far in this lecture. They were also evident in the reading that we did for last week, this week, and in the video that we just watched. All of these different factors have been invoked and used at some point in time or another to explain turnout, and they've had their day in the sun, so to speak. What we're going to do is we'll discuss each of them in turn, and we'll eventually begin to set up an analysis of some Latin American cases, and we'll study the Latin American countries to try to understand what leverage we can get on turnout using these different approaches. And so those families of approaches are as follows. First, cultural factors. Second, institutional variables. Third, socioeconomic variables and context. And fourth, aspects of the political process. So we'll discuss each of these in turn. So the most important cultural factors studied so far in the literature are undoubtedly trust and efficacy. Trust in institutions or in democracy at large, and efficacy or belief in the value or role or impact of one's vote. And these are sort of difficult to measure, but generally speaking, they're measured using surveys and attitudes and values and opinion surveys conducted in large samples of voters. And trust is usually pretty straightforward. It's measured as either satisfaction with or trust or belief in different institutions. And efficacy relates to beliefs or senses that one has regarding the impact of their vote. And these are important factors because trust in institutions is is very slippery and hard to sort of define and understand. But one thing that we know for sure is that it is there or it isn't. And where trust in institutions is strong and people believe that the parliament or the Congress is representing them and promoting their best interest, they're much more likely to go and vote. And it's because obviously they anticipate or they believe that it's worthwhile to take the time and that they will participate meaningfully in a process that will respond to them and respond to their preferences, and that they trust that that process will produce that result. Where trust is very low, by contrast, turnout is much lower as well, and people don't have satisfaction in or belief in institutions, and they don't believe that those institutions will promote their best interests or will behave in a way that is above board and not corrupt or will promote the general interest. People are unlikely to vote in a circumstance like that. In this data, this is data for European countries for, I believe, the period between 1990 and 2007. And it shows a pretty straightforward relationship between trust in parliament and voter turnout. But we could just as easily examine trust in the judiciary or trust in, say, the bureaucracy, whatever we wanted to look at. And we could look at trust in democracy as well. but we would anticipate seeing similar patterns. The expectation is that trust promotes participation and that mistrust promotes staying home and not participating. But there are also examples of places where trust is quite high, but turnout is lower. So places like maybe Finland or Hungary, relative to where we would expect it to be. And so there are always deviant cases, but generally speaking, the pattern appears to be quite strong. There's also, of course, a role for those institutional variables. And these relate to everything from registration laws and laws around when and where you can vote and how you can vote, to whether voting is mandatory or not, compulsory, as we sometimes refer to it as. These also refer to electoral formulas and the ways that votes are translated into seats. And so majoritarian systems or single member district systems, like in the United States, tend to bring turnout down because those systems are highly disproportional and there are a lot of wasted votes, in the sense that the winner of a plurality of the votes is elected and all other candidates and parties are eliminated regardless of how many votes they received relative to the winner. Disproportional systems or disproportional electoral formulas tend to bring down turnout. More proportional formulas, as you know and as we've seen, tend to increase turnout. Constitutional frameworks like unicameral versus bicameral legislatures also appear to be related to turnout. We know that unicameralism apparently increases turnout because of higher impact elections. And then party systems that present voters with more options tend to increase turnout, both because voters have more options, but maybe more importantly, because there's more voter mobilization by parties. And that seems to be especially critical because just think about it in terms of uh, a sheer numbers game. You have this many parties, you have that many parties on the ground engaged in outreach, engaged in mobilization. Five is different than two, 10 is different than five, on and on and on. So larger party systems tend to facilitate higher turnout. But it's also a careful balance because there are examples of countries with many parties where turnout is lower because people do not believe that the parties are capable or strong enough to represent them effectively, or work together effectively enough to govern in a meaningful way. And so it's obviously there's a careful balance between too many and too few. But I'm sure that many of you would argue that the two-party system in the United States is a sort of disadvantage as far as turnout is concerned because many people don't believe that their views are adequately represented by those two parties and they choose not to participate as a result. But on the issue of registration laws and mandatory voting, I actually want to show you this here, and hopefully you've noticed already that in the case of Chile, the the choice to abolish mandatory voting in, I believe that took place in 2012, resulted in a dramatic decrease in voter turnout. Voter turnout previously was about 85%. And in 2012, or in 2013, excuse me, after the abolition of mandatory voting, turnout was barely 49%. Pretty radical. That's like a 35% decrease in turnout just because of a institutional change whereby voting was no longer mandatory. That's a huge change. And that would suggest both that institutional variables do a lot of the work when explaining cross-national variation in turnout, and that those institutional variables are important catalysts to behavioral change. If you require people to vote, they will vote. They might not vote meaningfully, they might not actually cast a vote, but they will submit a ballot. And in that regard, they will participate. And I don't know what your opinion is about mandatory voting. Do you think that compulsory voting is compatible with democracy? Or do you think that requiring people to do anything is undemocratic? Any thoughts? So the question again is mandatory voting compatible with democracy? Brittany says no. But Brittany and others, what if it is shown to increase voter turnout so much, right? Like that's a difference of 35%. So like, how do we then, justify passing that up? That seems like a real advantage as far as like democratic performance is concerned, right? Like the participation of the electorate is one component of democratic performance. And so I certainly understand from like a normative perspective, requiring people to do something is coercive and might not be democratic in a pure sense. But if democracy partly depends on the functioning of the system, and if the performance of the system is partly dependent upon electoral participation, and compulsory voting increases participation, it seems like the end might justify the means. But I know that these are dicey questions, right? And it's never this simple. Gustavo says yes, in my eyes. He says the purpose of forcing people to vote is to help them be heard. Brittany says autocracies have really high voter turnout. That's true, Brittany, but let's make an argument of the merits of mandatory voting. And I don't disagree, but those are often high rates of turnout for other reasons, because the elections are not competitive, because the results themselves are usually inflated or rigged. Sometimes the rates of turnout that they report are not actually statistically like possible, based on some very loose assumptions about participation. So I agree with you, but I don't know if that's relevant here. It is an interesting discussion, and I'm not saying that there's an answer or a right answer to this. I think there are arguments on both sides. I think from the perspective of democratic performance, compulsory voting might have some merit. From the perspective of individual liberty, certainly it's difficult to justify. But this is why where we stand depends on where we sit, so we can be nuanced in tasteful and in very sophisticated in the way we think about this.
I think that a voter, like mandatory voter registration that doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, which is pretty common in countries like Australia, I think is an example that was given in the reading, is a net positive for democracy, because it's the government reinforcing the importance of voting towards the people. And while there is a law that says it, there's no formal coercion or direct pushing that you would see in
Okay, so let's play it with a hypothetical though, and say that we do give it teeth, right? And that we do make it so that it's enforced. Now what, right? Does that change how we feel about it? Because what we should do, I think, is try to give it, let's imagine a hypothetical where we have an effective mandatory voting law, right? Just like we would want to have an effective secret ballot, we would want to have an effective mandatory voting law if we were to have one at all. So then what? Are we comfortable with that or not? Samantha says, I would say yes, because it is encouraging citizens to do their civic duty and ultimately use their voice to express their concerns. Yeah, so the performance argument, for sure, right? So the functioning of the system, and I would agree with Samantha, it partly depends on the participation of the voters. And so in that regard, maybe that helps the functioning of the system. Carlos says yes, because voting is a part of democracy itself. Oscar says to an extent it is because it makes people participate, but also it might not be because people should also have the freedom to decide whether to participate or not. So Oscar is seeing that, you know, there are multiple sides to this, right? You know, the performance angle certainly encourages mandatory voting, but the liberty and the freedom angle and the individual angle maybe doesn't, right? So it's an interesting trade-off between the sort of collective institutional whole and the functioning of the democracy, which is obviously a collective thing, and then the individual freedom and the right of the individual. And oftentimes there is that tension between the individual and the collective. And I think that democracy is one place where that tension is apparent when it comes to this question of mandatory voting. Um, Courtney says, with compulsory voting, it gives more of an accurate reflection of community preferences. So this is possible, right? But some would say that with compulsory voting, you might distort preferences if you force uninformed voters to participate or if they don't vote in a meaningful way because of their irritation over voting involuntarily. And so that's one possibility. And you know, maybe that then gives some credence to Ishan's idea, where you introduce mandatory voting, but you don't really enforce it, so to speak, like in Australia, where it's like on the books. In that regard, in that way, it kind of sends a message about what is appropriate, but you know, you don't penalize people necessarily. I don't know what the answer is. It's an interesting question to me. I think that there really is a sort of tension between like the objective of democratic performance in the functioning of the system measured in terms of participation, and then like the protection of individual rights and freedoms, which is like the philosophical ideal, you know, the vision that we have of individual freedom associated with democracy. Voter turnout is obviously a question where we address both the individual as well as the collective uh, component. And I think that's what's interesting here. Now, the socioeconomic context is another place where we see both the individual and the collective sort of dimension. And remember that when we talk about the choice to vote, in an individual's choice to vote, some of the earliest factors that we considered in this class relate to things like income, education, literacy. These are factors that we considered contributors to voting. And higher income makes a person more capable of voting because they can take the day off from work, or they have the resources to vote ahead of time, or etc. Education makes people more informed. They're able to obtain information that they need to vote by mail, to find their polling place, to make informed choices, to understand the importance and the value of voting in the first place. Literacy is important because people better capable of reading and absorbing and processing information are more likely to understand the value of voting and to discern the value of it in the process of reading and writing and engaging in all of that. And then urbanization. We know that people who live in cities are often more likely to be involved in politics. And then we can think about countries and how countries as aggregates might behave based upon income levels, education levels, literacy rates, rates of urbanization. And so in the literature, it's common to argue that richer countries vote at higher rates, that more educated countries vote at higher rates, that more literate countries vote at higher rates, that countries where a larger proportion of the population lives in cities vote at higher rates. And generally speaking, many of these patterns hold. But there are some interesting wrinkles, and there are some plot twists that makes it kind of interesting to take a closer look at. And one of those twists is that GDP appears to be related to voter turnout in a less linear way than we initially thought. Originally, it was thought that there's a linear relationship between income and turnout. Richer countries are more likely to vote at higher rates, period. The propensity to vote is greater at higher rates of income. But it's actually been shown that it seems to be a different pattern. How richer countries, interestingly enough, would seem to vote at lower rates. There is a relationship where income gains correlate with increased turnout, but there's a point where richer countries actually start voting at lower and lower rates, to where countries like Luxembourg and Switzerland and the United States have relatively low rates of turnout, and yet they have high GDP per capita, high rates of individual income. That's quite interesting, and it's confounding to the original insights in the earlier research, which anticipated a relatively linear relationship between income and turnout. And what I want to suggest to you before I give you the rest of the story is that in countries like Switzerland and the United States, there's actually a political component that helps us to explain why voter turnout is relatively low. Does anyone know what that is? Why does Switzerland have such low turnout despite having such high income? Ishan says bicameralism. No, so that wasn't what I was thinking. I mean, that certainly is a consideration, right? That's a factor that we thought about.
In Switzerland, like, don't they like be asking their citizens to like vote on different issues like every 3 months? Like they're voting like pretty regularly.
Yeah, so what does that have to do with it? That's exactly right. How does that impact turnout?
I mean, like, imagine that. Like, imagine like in the US, you're expected to go out to a poll every 3 months to vote. Like
Yeah,
that's gonna be very I would be very annoyed if they expected me to go vote every 3 months. And I probably wouldn't do it every 3 months because it's just a lot to ask.
yeah, exactly. There's this thing called voter fatigue, like election fatigue is the concept. And it's this idea that if you have an election too frequently, people won't vote. You know, they'll get exhausted. If you ask them to go to the polls too often, they'll begin to perceive the individual elections to be of less importance, and they'll put in less work, and they just won't vote as frequently because they are less able to, and they're less informed, and so on. And so, for all these reasons, right? They just won't go to the polls as much. And so in Switzerland, they have a lot of referenda where you vote on like everything. And very, very frequent elections has contributed to a lot of election fatigue, and people just don't vote for all those different issues. And this is an example of what's been called low salience elections, or elections that are low stakes elections or less important. And voters are sophisticated and smart, and they know that the election is not that important in the grand scheme of things. And if they're voting all the time on low stakes issues, they won't vote all the time. They won't go to the polls. And so turnout is lower when there are lots of referenda and when the elections are low salience elections. And the United States has also been considered to be an example of low salience elections. Low salience elections can also be uh, relevant or useful categories when, for example, there are lots of midterms or special elections, or where voters can't easily see how their participation will impact the outcome. And so in the US, some of the elections have been considered low salience elections for these reasons. And so in these cases, income doesn't appear to be related to turnout because low salience elections and the political dynamics in the political process nullify some of the effects of income. And so, there's always more to the story. And we will discuss the rest of that as well as get into the Latin American cases on Friday. But thanks everybody for being here and being a part of it. I always enjoy our talks, and I'll see you on Friday. Have a good one.